Here's William Lane Craig to try to convince Alex O'Connor that animals suffering is just fine.
The main reason people have for not believing in God is the existence of evil or suffering. I prefer to say suffering because evil is a sort of morally laden term, right? And to me, this argument is sort of endless and never makes very much progress in the sense that people suffer and theologians have theodicies for why they suffer. It's because of free will, it's because of
But don't
soul
you
building.
think that genuine advance was made by Alvin Plantinga and his discussion of the free will defense?
Not really.
No, it doesn't explain why free will is so valuable as to warrant the suffering that allegedly results from it. It doesn't explain why free will would even necessitate suffering. If we have free will, which also isn't convincingly established, why can't we freely choose to accept God or not accept God without suffering being a consequence of not accepting him? Why, if Adam and Eve made the choice to not live in the Garden of Eden, couldn't they have had the option to live happily outside the garden, without any suffering? Did this all-powerful God not have the power to make that happen? The argument claims that there may be no logically possible way to give people freedom without them doing anything evil, but it's far from clear why this would be the case. Doesn't God himself both have free will and consistently abstain from evil? If God can have free will and also never do evil, why can't he create humans that also both have free will and never do anything evil?
What I mean to say is that, no.
You don't think he put the death knell to the logical version of the problem of evil?
No, because he would have to show that it is a logical contradiction for God to allow free will without allowing suffering. He didn't do that. There's no logical problem with an all-powerful God giving humans both free will and immunity to suffering. Plantinga simply argues that God can't force free beings to only ever do good things. He never explains why God could not make human beings free to do evil but immune to any suffering that may result.
I'm not convinced in that, I'm not sure that the logical problem of evil ever really held up. But I don't...
Oh, well, that's all right.
I kind of don't want to...
That's progress.
I think it does, because it seems very much a contradiction to me that a being can be universally loving and allow the people he loves to suffer when he has the power to achieve any goal without them suffering.
But I kind of don't want to talk about that because I think that there is a class of individuals who are usually completely ignored in the discussion of suffering. And it's, of course, non-human animals.
Yes.
Theodicies that are provided for suffering, the existence of suffering, the fact that there's human free will, the fact that there was a fall, the fact that our souls will somehow be developed, the fact that higher order goods like bravery and courage can be achieved, are plausible.
The only examples of goods that are logically impossible without suffering are goods that are never good enough to make the suffering worthwhile. Sure, you can't be courageous if you never have anything to be afraid of, but I'd happily forego the experience of bravery in exchange for never having anything to fear in the first place. I'd happily forego the experience of healing in order to never be injured in the first place. I'd rather forego experiencing forgiveness in order to avoid ever being wronged by anyone in the first place whom I would then need to forgive. These are all goods that are never worth their price.
But none of them apply to non-human animals. None of them apply to these animals who, for hundreds of millions of years...
Yeah. I've written quite a bit on the problem of animal suffering.
I know.
Not only did the animals not deserve it, it's completely unclear why something that humans did would cause it. And even more absurdly, it seems to have caused it retroactively. Animals were suffering for millions of years before humans ever existed, let alone ate any fruit that they were told not to. So how could suffering be the result of original sin?
So perhaps we can rehash it. Because I'd like to know why it is that you think that for these hundreds of millions of years, suffering is the defining quality of the animal experience, to the extent that this is the mechanism God chose to bring about complexity of life on Earth. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and destruction of the unfit.
And it's even possible to have that without suffering existing. Plants evolve and go extinct all without ever suffering.
Disease, predation, starvation, for hundreds of millions of years. And for some reason, when we get to humans, something kind of special happens, we're ensouled, whatever it might be, such that our suffering gets to be redeemed, but not theirs. We're talking, if I were to go into the details of what happens to animals in the wild on a regular basis, I probably couldn't upload this footage to YouTube because it would get flagged for being too extreme, as you well know. So perhaps in the time remaining, we could talk about why it is you think that God would not just allow this, but build it into the very mechanism by which life comes to vary in its complexity on Earth.
Why did God invent the phenomenon of suffering in the first place? The naturalistic explanation makes a lot of sense. Suffering evolved because it conveys the advantage of disincentivizing injury. If God made us suffer to disincentivize us from injuring ourselves, that seems to be in a bit of tension with the idea that he values us having free will. Because if he's building in a motivational system that inclines us towards certain behaviors and against others, he's putting his thumb on the scales of our alleged free will. And the baffling thing is that he does so inconsistently. If he gave us inclinations and aversions to incentivize maintaining our health and avoiding injury, and that apparently doesn't count as undermining our free will, why would making us inherently and consistently motivated to be averse to sin undermine our free will? If he's not undermining our free will by making us want to avoid the pain of injury and illness, why would he be undermining our free will by making us want to avoid eating the fruit he told us not to eat? Why did he even create a tree of knowledge with tasty-looking fruit? Why didn't he make it a steaming donkey turd of knowledge instead?
The question here is whether or not the existence of animal suffering in the world is more plausible given naturalism or atheism than it is given theism.
It is, and it has a clear purpose under naturalism. It isn't at all clear what purpose it serves if theism is true.
And I would argue that animal suffering is vastly more improbable given naturalism or atheism than theism. And therefore, even if our inability to penetrate divine psychology and say what reason would have God would have for choosing an evolutionary process, which I think we can speculate about, nevertheless, the balance of probability is overwhelmingly in favor of theism. Animal suffering is more plausible, probable on theism. Now, why do I say that? Well, the reason is because if naturalism were true, then it is incomprehensibly more probable that there wouldn't even be life, much less sentient life.
That's only if you assume that a universe hostile to life would be more probable than the one we have. We have no reason to believe a universe different from the one we inhabit is even possible, let alone more probable.
Right.
That could experience suffering. And of course, we're back here to the old fine-tuning argument, aren't we?
The one that says that an all-powerful God would have to fiddle-fuck around with the conditions of the universe in order to get life to exist in it, and is thus obviously absurd?
That given the fine-tuning of the universe, this is vastly more probable given theism than given naturalism.
Exactly the opposite is true. If there were an all-powerful God, that God would have the power to put life into a universe with any set of conditions. In fact, if we lived in a universe with conditions that made the natural development of life impossible, it would then make a lot more sense to say that the existence of life is not a merely natural phenomenon.
As Michael Murray shows in his book, Nature, Red and Tooth and Claw, even sentient animals like sheep and goats and dogs and cats, while they have pain awareness, they do not have that second order awareness of knowing that they are themselves in pain, which human beings as self-conscious subjects do. And that makes human pain and suffering qualitatively distinct from animal suffering.
Jack, I'm
Thank you,
sorry, I have to put my foot.
Oh,
Can I have quick, brief reply? Because we're taking the question from the lady in the cool jeans, fallback.
This idea that animals suffer but they're not aware that they're suffering is to me a self-contradictory statement.
This never made sense to me. What does it mean to suffer without being aware that you're suffering? It seems like suffering is a kind of awareness. It's a subjective experience. I'm sure most non-human animals don't suffer in all of the ways that humans do. The ones that have no self-awareness are unlikely to be able to feel sorry for themselves like humans do. When humans are sick, for example, they can not only suffer from the pain of the illness, but also lament that they're not out having fun, or they may feel guilty for not being able to perform their responsibilities. An aardvark probably can't suffer in these particular ways, but I don't see why they can't suffer from the pain itself or be aware of it, even if they don't conceptualize it in the same way humans do.
To suffer is to be aware that you are suffering. You cannot be in pain without knowing you're in pain. That is the same thing as not being in pain. And if it is not the same thing, if it turns out that it's fine because these animals, although they suffer, they don't know that they're suffering, so it doesn't really matter. I don't know if any of you are pet owners. If you would believe that your animal, when it's in pain, doesn't somehow know that it's in pain. But good news, because it doesn't matter too much.
It's a great
Bill, I'm going to put my foot down. Take a question over here.
I'm sorry, then you should be able to do...
Question from this young
then
lady.
You should be able to do whatever you want.
I miss Johnny so much.
Why not?
I'd like to jump in.
Why not break their legs?
You just need...
Why not?
You need...
Why not
leg
break
breaking
their
would be
legs?
sweet relief for me at this point in time.
It's...
Your question, and if you can direct it to Bill or Alex.
I'm sorry. If somebody
you've
asks
just-
a question, if somebody asks a question, I will take the time to say what I'm about to say, which is this: why not break the legs of your animals? Why not rip off their tails? Yes, they may suffer, but they don't know that they're suffering,
Because
so it
that would
doesn't really
violate a
matter.
divine command to steward the earth and to care for the earth. We have a
how is it
divine
uncaring?
command.
According to Craig, the only reason it's bad to torture animals is because God says so. Also, if the reason we shouldn't injure animals is because we must be stewards of nature, why should we find it less objectionable to break the branch off of a tree?
And it seems to me that what he has said is, a loving God could not allow human suffering. A loving God could not allow animal suffering. I'm sorry, animal suffering or human suffering is not evidence for the existence of God one way or another.
Well, that depends on to what degree being loving is essential to the definition of God you use. If the definition of God that you use is not fundamentally loving, then there is no problem of suffering.
What you do, you start with a proposition, is it more likely that God exists or not? And speaking for myself and for the reasons which Dr. Craig advanced, I think the balance of the argument, God exists. And if we then try and say, why does he do this? Why does he do that? I don't know. I'm not God. And either does Alex O'Connor.
Well, if God is described as being all-powerful and perfectly loving, would it not make sense to expect him to behave in a way that's consistent with those features? And if it looks like he's not behaving in a way that's consistent with those features, does it not make perfect sense to at least question whether he really has them?
Alex.
Was that a question?
Joining in the debate at this point.
Well, if I might just make a comment on that.
Go on.
The questioner, I think, is actually making a very good point. It's been said that one man's modus tollens is another man's modus ponens.
Quite right.
That is to say, the theist can agree that if God exists, then gratuitous, that is unnecessary, purposeless suffering does not exist.
Even purposeful suffering would not exist because there is no purpose that makes up for the suffering that an all-powerful God would not have the power to achieve without allowing the suffering.
If God does not exist, or rather, if God exists, then gratuitous suffering does not exist. But then the theist can say, we have very good arguments and evidence that God exists. And therefore it follows that gratuitous suffering does not exist. That's the logical consequence. And so Dan Howard Snyder, in his anthology on the problem of evil, says, the problem of evil is really only a problem for theists who have lousy grounds for theism.
In other words, for all theists.
But if you've got good grounds for theism, the problem of evil isn't a problem. As the questioner said, we don't know why God permits the suffering in the world, but that's irrelevant to the fact that if we have good grounds for believing God exists, then that gives good grounds for thinking that the suffering in the world really isn't gratuitous, but serves some greater good.
Again, it's not enough that it serves a greater good. In order to be justified, it would have to serve a greater good that an all-powerful God would not have the power to achieve without allowing suffering. That's a contradiction.
To a question over here, because you had 3 replies. Alex, a brief reply.
That's fine. If your vision of God,
We're not doing this. We're not doing this.
If your vision of God is some kind of impersonal entity which creates the universe at some first moment in time due to the impossibility of an actual infinite regress, and then just doesn't give a squat about suffering. If that's the God that you believe in, then fine. But that's not the God that most people are worshipping in church. That's not the God who supposedly resurrects Jesus from the dead for the purpose, by the way, of human salvation. Meaning that actually, at least in the case of human beings, their mental states do actually matter quite a bit. Which means that if there is some unexpected aspect of that mental existence, that needs to be explained and is less expected on the hypothesis of theism. Of course, Christian theism.
If you believe that God loves everyone, why would you not expect him to prevent suffering in the first place? Why is this not a reasonable inference to make? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.